Good morning. It's Friday, April 17th. I trust that you're staying on track and listening to the videos within a day or two of them being posted. That we get just a little bit of history every day. All right, let's continue. We've been developing the prelude to World War II, and today we actually get to the beginning of the war. So yesterday when we left off, we were talking about the what was called the Munich Agreement. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of England met with Hitler to discuss the fate of Czechoslovakia, even though Czechoslovakia was not present. Neville Chamberlain agreed on behalf of the Allies to betray their ally and to abandon Czechoslovakia to Germany. And so Germany received essentially everything they wanted from Czechoslovakia without fighting, which you would think would make Hitler delighted, but instead he was furious. Hitler wanted war. He felt that was the way in which Germany would assert its authority and take over all of Europe. And he was looking for any excuse to initiate this war. He thought demanding Czechoslovakia would certainly provoke a war. In reality, it seems that at least for Hitler, some of some of the people that worked for him realized that the Allies would cave on this, but he thought certainly they would fight for Czechoslovakia, and they did not. He believed that 1938 was the right year for Germany to launch war. He was actually wrong. We know historically that the Allies were closer to Germany's strength in 38 than they were in 39. Ironically, had Hitler waited for 2 more years, if he'd waited till 1941 to initiate World War II, he likely would have been overwhelmingly more powerful than the Allies. There were a number of things the Germans were developing that weren't ready yet, but would be ready by 41 and would have just given them a devastating advantage. But 39 was destined to be the year. So realizing how easy it was, Hitler turned his attention now from Czechoslovakia to Poland. Poland was in much the same position as Czechoslovakia. It had an agreement of mutual defense with both England and France, but that seemed to be rather pointless since England and France had collectively done nothing for Czechoslovakia. Furthermore, there was some historical ties to some of the lands of Poland with Germany. So the obvious failure of Munich meant that the two nations, though pledged to Poland, it seemed unlikely that they would do anything. And so Hitler seriously started planning for the invasion of Poland. To prepare for this, Hitler wanted to finalize his alliances. So with Italy, he created what was called the Pact of Steel, and it guaranteed that Italy and Germany were pledged to each other in the case of any large-scale war. That was expected. But the surprise was that Hitler was able to negotiate what was called the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union. Basically, the agreement was if Russia fought anyone, Germany wouldn't get involved, and if Germany fought anyone, Russia wouldn't get involved. So it's not quite an alliance, but at least it's a pledge of not becoming an enemy. That was a major surprise. The communists and the fascists were bitter enemies because they were both trying to accomplish the same things in the same way, and they were fighting for the same space politically. So they didn't offer alternative visions. They really offered the same vision for the world, except one was based on class distinctions and the other was based on nationalist distinctions. And there was a long and bitter divide that had resulted in bloodshed for decades. The Non-Aggression Pact shocked everyone else. It shocked the world. Stalin was delighted. He thought he had taken care of what he considered the main threat to communist Soviet Union. Hitler was, I wouldn't say delighted, but at least content because it gave him the time to focus his attention elsewhere. Now, what the rest of the world did not know is that this non-aggression statement had a secret provision that allowed both of these nations to simultaneously invade Poland and divide it in two. Most people think World War II was started by the Nazis. That's only half true. World War II was started by the Nazis and the communists. So World War II usually is officially recognized as beginning September 1st, 1939, when both Germany and the Soviet Union collectively invaded Poland. They went to work. Poland put up a stout defense. It was a brave nation, did some wonderful things, and even after its fall, some of its soldiers were able to escape and continue the fight. But it had no chance. It had two major world powers. It had Germany invading from its west and Russia invading from its east. And so it was squeezed and conquered. In the west, Germany was using a new strategy called Blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. The German High Command had learned the lessons of World War I. They were not going to be caught into a war of attrition in which they sent thousands and thousands of men to pointless deaths for the gain of nothing. So they developed a highly mobile form of warfare in which the goal was to penetrate as quickly and deeply as possible. Now, to do this, it required a coordination that had never yet been mastered. It was a coordination between infantry and armor, and in Germany, armor was known as panzers. Now, usually we think of tanks, but it also includes armored personnel carriers, and collectively they're both supported by mobile artillery. It required a lot of organization, it required a lot of intelligence by field commanders, and it also required a great deal of, let's just say, boldness in order to be able to seize initiatives when they presented themselves. Now, this was further maximized by the new tactics on the aircraft of the German Air Force, which was called the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was dedicated to supporting the forces on the ground. And so you had all this tremendous sense of unity in purpose, meaning that they were supporting each other. So here you see in this picture a number of things. You see Panzer tanks. You see these are armored personnel carriers. So there are multiple tanks there in this line right here. But just as important are the tanks are all the personnel carriers. That means you have both infantry and armor. So whenever there is a roadblock, whenever there's anything holding them back, the men disembark, they hop on out, and once they hop on out, they're able to establish defensive positions and fight back or advance, and they're supported by the tanks. It's a very complicated way of doing war, but a very powerful way of doing war. And this blitzkrieg was new. Remember, the world had just transitioned away from cavalry and the horses. And here we have armor, and it was just such a new idea, and nobody had really, at this point, mastered it yet, like the Germans had. At the same time as Germany and the Soviet Union are invading, they're both invading Poland, they're also, the Soviet Union also conquered Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Baltic republics fall. This was nothing but rank aggression. Never forget how much of a role the Soviet Union and the communists played in World War II. Later on, we're going to see the Soviet Union joins the sides of the Allies, not because of any goodness, but simply because Hitler is going to attack them and force their hand. But they were just as complicit and just as evil, and the Soviet Union played just a significant role in the beginning of World War II, as did Germany. Now, the Soviets also invaded Finland. That was an entirely different story. Finland had been, the territory of Finland had been over the years controlled by Sweden, controlled by Russia, but Finland wanted to be free. Eventually, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. It was a very costly campaign. Eventually, they were able to gain some rather worthless territory, but it cost them greatly in terms of lives. The Finns lost about 200,000 men, which for Finland was a tremendous sacrifice. The Soviets lost about 1 million men. This led to the legend of the Finnish army in the Soviet Union. This is an example of what a Finnish soldier looked like. They were built to fight in the snow. They used reindeer for various needs. They were well dressed. They came in like ghosts. They struck and they pulled out. The Finns as soldiers were just tremendous. This is Simo Haya. 259 confirmed sniper kills, no scope. 505 total kills. This is what an incredible hero looks like. He once captured a Russian, took him back to camp for a night of drinking and singing and intelligence, got the Russian to tell him all that was going on with the current outlay with men and positioning, and then sent the Russian back. The Russian had such a good time, he actually asked to stay. Men like Simo Haya and others led to a famous joke that went around during the time. There's a story told that one Finnish soldier was worth 1,000 Soviet soldiers. That was the story that was told. In one night, there was, as the Soviets had made camp, there was, the story goes, this is just like I said, it's just a story. The story goes that across the frozen lake, they heard a voice. They heard the voice, and it said something along the lines of, "I'm a Finnish soldier. Send 1,000 men, and I'll kill them all." The Soviet commander was furious. He took 1,000 men. He ordered them to go across the lake and to kill that Finnish soldier. And so 1,000 Soviet soldiers get up, they march across the lake, lots of shooting, lots of grenades, lots of violence, and then silence. And then the voice again, "I'm a Finnish soldier, I can kill 1,000 of your men, send them over." And this time the Soviet commander is just absolutely infuriated. Did 1,000 of his men die? So he grabbed another 1,000, marched them across the lake and had them attack. Once again, gunfire, and grenades, and all the things, and once again silence. Finally, he hears the voice again. "I'm a Finnish soldier, I can kill 1,000 of your men, send them across." And so this time, the colonel sends another 1,000, and he just doesn't understand. How can they not succeed? And once again goes across, and there's gunfire, and there's grenades, and there's silence. But this time, one soldier comes running back, a Soviet soldier, and he's running with all his might, and he runs up to the commander, and he says, "Commander, it's a trap." And the Soviet commander says, "Well, how's it a trap?" And he says, "There are 2 Finnish soldiers." And the idea is that the 2 Finnish soldiers had overwhelmed and killed all of them. And certainly a story, but the ghost of the Finnish soldiers haunted the Soviets. They were quite successful for quite some time. So after Germany and the Soviet Union conquered, everything stopped. So once again, just like in World War I, World War II develops on an Eastern Front and a Western Front. The Eastern Front, though, essentially ceases to exist. The Soviet Union has taken Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, parts of Finland, and parts of Poland. Germany has taken parts of Poland. And at this point, all that exists is Germany and the Soviet Union. And as of right now, they're not fighting. And so the fighting in the East stops. And now all the attention is going to be focused on the West. The Allies were still completely unprepared. France and England were in no condition to fight. But Germany also needed time. Germany needed time to redistribute troops. So they had almost all their forces right now on the Eastern Front. And they needed the winter of 1939 into the early winter of 1940 to reposition all their personnel. The weather prevented much movement. The rest of 39 and 40 were called the Phony War, or it was called the Sitzkrieg. So after 1 to 2 months of incredibly intense fighting and a lot of conquest, everything just stops. So that changed in April of 1940. Now that the weather had cleaned up a little bit, Germany launched again. This time they invaded Norway and Denmark, and both those nations surrendered with surprisingly little resistance. In Norway, things were complicated by the presence of a bunch of traitors, fifth columnists. One in particular was a man named Vidkun Quisling. Quisling has now become, like in America, the phrase Benedict Arnold, a traitor. Well, Quisling means a traitor. And this made the work of the Nazis in Norway much easier. Europe began to wonder if anyone could stand against the Germans. There was a strong degree of pessimism that had formed in France and even in Great Britain by early 1940. Now, during this time, France still felt reasonably confident. They had built the Maginot Line, and it was designed to stop a 1,000,000-man army, including tanks. But in May, everything changed because the Maginot Line was the border between France and Germany. It was not built on the border between France and Belgium. So what does Germany do? The same thing it did in World War I. It invaded Holland and Luxembourg, conquered them in less than a week, and then it invaded Belgium, and it conquered Belgium in less than 2 weeks. So now Germany had an entrance into France that did not involve the Maginot Line. This is the German troops as they marched through the towns of these small nations, whether it's Holland or Belgium. They were largely unopposed, I'll put it that way. The Maginot Line was now functionally useless, so the combined British and French forces, they reinforced the Belgian border. But along the Belgian border, they ignored the southern Belgian border because it was dense with forest in a region called the Ardennes. So with limited manpower, the Germans dismantled the anti-tank obstacles of the Ardennes forest, and they went right through the forest. And they poured into France. The Germans during this time had largely gained air superiority as well. So the German general Ernst Rommel, a brilliant tactician, one of the greatest generals of the 20th century, maybe of all time, one of the first men to really understand tanks and what they could do and how they are to be used, he continually disobeyed orders. The orders were to stop and to gather, and then combine. The Germans would advance in a combined manner. Rommel just kept pushing, pushing and pushing and pushing. And because of that, the French could never set up a defense, because every time they tried digging a ditch and every time they tried turning and establishing a defense, Rommel was already attacking them. So in response, the French kept retreating. Now, because of this, the French realized they all had to retreat. So if this is the battle line right here, and if this is where Rommel is pushing in, if the entire line does not retreat, what happens is the line begins to look like this. And if it looks like this, Rommel can turn and he can encircle and destroy. So in order to prevent this, what happens is the entire French line starts retreating together, largely because Rommel is pushing in one particular location. In response, as I mentioned, the French were still retreating. In the beginning of June, French civilians were evacuating. The French army was crumbling after just a month of fighting. French towns were often being destroyed, especially the town of Dunkirk. From May 26th to June 4th, the BEF, which was the British Expeditionary Force, that's the British Army in Europe, and a large portion of the French army, they were trapped at the coast of a town called Dunkirk. The German army was right behind them and was ready to crush them. And right before what would have been certain doom and destruction, a providential intervening happened. Hermann Goering, the German head of the Luftwaffe, the German head of the Air Force, and a close associate of Adolf Hitler, convinced Hitler to stop the army and let his bombers have the glory of destroying the French and British armies. Now, this made life miserable for the soldiers, but it saved their lives because bombs can only do so much work, and had the German army just pushed ahead, they would have certainly destroyed the British and French. But because they let the German bombers do it, it gave them time. During this time, Winston Churchill was now chosen as Prime Minister of Great Britain. As I mentioned, there was a strong sense of defeatism and discouragement spreading throughout France and England. The general idea is that no one could stop the Germans and we're going to lose. There was one man who refused to bow down to that, and that was Winston Churchill. So as he was organizing his government, he gave the order to send every boat possible across the channel to, as he said, bring the boys home. Fishing boats, luxury yachts, mail boats, whatever. If it could get there, go and get as many troops as possible. Over 800 boats responded, manned by fishermen, manned by weekend sailors, whoever they were, they went. Over the course of a week, 336,000 men were rescued so that they could fight again in the future. It was a tremendous accomplishment, but it was still a defeat. All their equipment was left behind, but it did leave an army in place to defend Britain, and it meant that Germany could not make this a quick and final war. This is a picture of some of those boats. You can see they're just utterly crowded, but these are small packet boats. These are sailing yachts. But they did their job, and the men saved hundreds of thousands of lives that would be used later, that would eventually rescue Britain and eventually push Germany back. The French government refused to continue to fight. So while the British would march on, would soldier on, as Churchill said, we will fight on the land and on the sea and in the air, we will never surrender. And in that speech, incidentally, Churchill made a very prophetic announcement until God should raise up the new world with all her power to come and deliver the old. So during this time, the French negotiated a surrender. Field Marshal Philippe Pétain, who was one of the heads of the French army during World War I. He became head of what was called the Vichy government, or Vichy France. That was the French government that cooperated and bowed down to the Germans. So much French territory was given outright to Germany, but part of it remained France, and that was Vichy France. Vichy France obeyed whatever Germany told them. Now, there was a leader of what was called Free France. His name was Charles de Gaulle. Unfortunately, he was an arrogant man with more confidence than actual achievement. We're going to see in the years ahead, he creates his own problems. But to his credit, he fought against the Germans and refused to surrender. This is Adolf Hitler as he arrives in Paris for his one time there, as he stands in front of the Eiffel Tower. He enjoyed seeing, he actually went and found the railroad car that Germany had surrendered in back in 1918, pulled it out, and made France surrender in the very same place. Within France, the resistance began. The resistance was an underground group of guerrillas, guerrilla warfare fighters who were trying to continue to take the fight to Germany. The resistance was limited. It made some contributions, but they were limited. In some ways, the resistance has become a myth to cover up how poorly France performed in the war and how little they actually did accomplish. And so there's a lot of movies and books written about the bravery of the resistance, and the people who fought in the resistance were brave, but they represented a very small percentage of Frenchmen. Most French people just went along with the German invasion. In the south, Italy launched an invasion of Egypt, but Egypt at the time was held by Great Britain. The Italians were absolutely crushed. And so here in 1940-41, Germany was forced to send troops to rescue its ally from complete embarrassment. And so tomorrow we'll pick up with the war as it continues in 40 and 41, especially in North Africa.